Hi, and welcome to the second IDC diatribe video on shedding light on your AGP report. I'm Anders Carlson, an adult endocrinologist and a medical director at the International Diabetes Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm thrilled to be with you today to talk a little bit more about how we can use the AGP report to help you achieve better glucose outcomes. And so thank you to the diatribe community and thank you for all the work you do in this space. So you've seen from the first video with Dr. Bergenstahl how to standardize CGM data and visualize it on the AGP report. And we also saw how that data is organized in a way to make it very usable and user-friendly for both patients, their loved ones, and their care team. So what we're going to focus on here today is how to analyze that CGM data in a systematic way that can help you use the data between either yourself, your family, your friends, and your care team to optimize the glucose outcomes. And so here is an AGP report, as you saw in the first video with Dr. Bergenstahl, and it's organized into three sections. The top section is the metrics and targets, so your goals and your time and ranges. The middle section is the AGP profile, showing the actual days overlapping each other. And at the bottom is the daily views, each individual day of CGM data from that download period spelled out in kind of a calendar format. And the AGP is really designed to be clean, organized, user-friendly. And what we'll talk about here in this session is how to use it to analyze the data. And so focusing on the middle section, the AGP, you can see highlighted in green are the target range from 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. And that's really where we want to see patients spending most of their time. The black line is the median, so half of glucose values are above it and half are below it. The dark shaded area shows where 50% of glucose values from that CGM period are located. So 50% of the time is in that dark shaded area. And then the light shaded area is 90% of the time. So 5% of glucoses are above it and 5% are below it. And the periods where you see the most blue, the biggest spread, if you will, are the times of highest variability. And so over here, you can see the times of low, very low, and high, very high as well. So what do you look for when you look at an AGP? And really the very quick look, when you eyeball it for the first time, what I always look for is the periods of hypoglycemia. So how much time and where is the patient spending time in the hypoglycemia range? So in this example, you can see that the bottom line, the 5% line, is low in the 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. range, and again in the 3 p.m. to maybe 5:30 or 6 p.m. range. So your eye kind of goes right to where it's low. Then I look at where it's high as another opportunity to try to get our glucose profile more into the flat, narrow, and in range FNIR, as you've heard in the previous session. And then I look at where it's the most variable, where the blue is the widest, and that might show us some opportunities on a day-to-day basis to look at why things on one day are running quite high and maybe on another day lower. Now, below that, the third panel on the AGP report are the daily glucose profiles. And so this is spelling out each of the CGM days, one next to another, and lets you see how one day sort of flows into the next day and also see patterns that maybe aren't clear from the AGP itself. So for instance, work schedule, weekends, days of increased physical activity or sports. And here too, I always start kind of right away looking at what is going well for that patient. I think we all acknowledge that diabetes is a really difficult disease to manage, and no day is perfect, and we never expect any day to be perfect. We'll take them when they happen, but it's really, you know, supporting the patient and letting them know that you know, small changes, small movements in the time and range are important. And so here I'd like to highlight for this patient, you know, here are 2 days that look really good. I mean, what happened on those days? Were you watching things more closely? Were you following your CGM on your phone more closely? Were you more active that day? I kind of want to engage them on what has been going well. And you'll note that neither of those 2 days are 100% time and range. No day will be 100% time and range. That's unrealistic to set for patients. And so, you know, at IDC, we've really kind of championed the, you know, 70% goal. Time and range is really, you know, it's reasonable for many patients. It's achievable, and it gets to that idea that you don't have to be 100% perfect every day. So I think that's where it's good to start. Next, it's good to look at the hypoglycemia. So as we were looking at on the AGP, try to find the times when the glucose is going low. And on the dailies, you can see, you know, is it happening one day leading into another, meaning it's happening overnight, or is it happening because of a correction for a high that then pretty quickly drops low? And that you wouldn't necessarily see on the AGP profile. And then next, we look at hyperglycemia as a place that maybe we can intervene after addressing the hypoglycemia. And trying to see, you know, is there any patterns to this? Is it happening more on weekends than weekdays, work days, and so on? So really trying to find patterns is how this section of the AGP can be useful. So let's talk through a couple real-life examples using the AGP report. And so first, we're going to look at what's working, what can we improve on, you know, kind of analyzing the data, and then turning that data into something actionable, some changes, you know, small, tangible changes that we can make to try to optimize the time and range. And so here's an example. This is an elderly married couple that I've followed for probably a decade now, and they both have long-standing type 2 diabetes, and they tend to run A1Cs just slightly above goal in the 8 range or so. They both use a regimen of insulin using background and mealtime insulin, which is to say they have 1 injection a day of a long-acting insulin, and then at meals, they take a short-acting insulin, probably 2 or 3 times a day. And that's also called multiple daily injections, or MDI, or a basal bolus regimen. And neither one of them really endorse symptomatic hypoglycemia. Lucy does say, though, that Sam on some mornings seems a little bit more sleepy than he is other days. But no one really has had any significant hypoglycemia to speak of. And what's interesting is both of them have, you know, very similar routines. They probably couldn't be more similar in terms of sharing the same meals. They go on walks together. They take their insulin at the exact same time as each other, and they both use finger stick glucoses, but don't check all that much. And so we meet and you know, we kind of talk about their A1Cs just kind of running a little bit too high, and I don't really get enough of a pattern from their finger stick glucoses. So I offer to them to use a blinded CGM, meaning a CGM that's worn for 14 days, but they aren't following the glucose data in real time. It's all being stored on the device for me to download after those 14 days. And so here's Sam's download. And so right away, you can see that he's got 8% time below 70, and half of that, 4%, is below 54. And remember that 1% is about 15 minutes, so 4% below 54 is about an hour a day. So he's spending a lot of time in hypoglycemia. Of course, about 50% in range and still with some hyperglycemia as well. But you can see that from his AGP, immediately your eye is drawn to the fact that his hypoglycemia is almost exclusively in the overnight and early AM hours, kind of the the 3 to 6:30, 7 a.m. range. And then he's high, after breakfast, lunch, and dinner later in the day. So those maybe observations that his wife was having, that he was a little sleepy, were likely episodic hypoglycemia. Now, Lucy, on the other hand, has a similar time in range, but really doesn't have as much or nearly as much time in the hypoglycemia range. So 3% less than 70 and 1% less than 54. And that's within the acceptable or sort of expected amount of time that one would have in those ranges being treated with a multiple daily injection regimen of insulin. So her profile, relatively flat and in range overnight, then kind of going up higher throughout the day, and then coming back down in the evening, and maybe even dropping a little bit more than we'd like after dinner. And so if you line them up together, you can see that what we did for Sam was to reduce his background insulin and then increase his mealtime insulins. Whereas for Lucy, we left her background insulin alone, increased her breakfast and lunch dose, and then we turned down her dinner dose a little bit just because she seemed to be dropping quite a bit after dinner. And when I saw them back, they were doing a much better job at checking their finger sticks, more consistently because of the observations we saw here. And with those changes, we were able to really bring both of them back down into target range, minimize their hypoglycemia, and the A1C actually came down a little bit as well. And so what we can learn from here is that, despite having very similar A1C levels and treatment regimens and so on, the AGP was quite a bit different between these two individuals. And the CGM helped us identify hypoglycemia for Sam that he wasn't previously recognizing, and also patterns where they're having hypoglycemia as well as hyperglycemia. And as a side note, just remember that hypoglycemia, particularly in elderly patients or patients who perhaps are less aware to hypoglycemia, can be a really, really dangerous phenomenon. And so we were all very thankful that we were able to identify this and avoid it for them. And we worked very quickly with them to adjust those insulins and make sure that they had close follow-up. So what can you take away from this to your own AGP report or the AGP report of your loved one? Really, it's key that you review the data frequently and perhaps even once a week or every other week to try to find patterns and improve that time and target range and reduce the hypoglycemia. Diabetes is a dynamic disease, and just remember that what works this week might not work 3 months from now or 6 months from now. And so it's important that we together, both the patient and the family and the care team, are frequently looking at these data and making adjustments as we go. And secondly, that piece there of really close contact with your diabetes care team is really important, because just having this data and looking at it is one thing, but making sure that we see it and we know that you're making changes is crucial. And on the flip side of that, what you learn from your patterns, if you notice, I saw this on my CGM, I made this change to my insulin dosing or to my exercise, those sort of diabetes hacks are really useful to us to relay to other patients. That's how we learn as well. So, when you learn something about yourself, please let your diabetes team know, because that's how we learn and that's how we help our other patients live with diabetes. So here's a second case. This is a 28-year-old female with type 1 diabetes for about 15 years. Her last A1C has been sort of in the 8 to 8.5 range, so above goal. And she started CGM within the last 6 months, and it's been somewhat reluctant. She didn't want to have anything attached to her body. And previously, she did really, really well maintaining tight glucose management during pregnancy by just using a glucose meter. So she's a little skeptical about the CGM, but but she's willing to give it a try. And she too is on a multiple daily injection regimen with insulin pens. And her big concerns are that, she does well during the day when she's at work. She's sort of in charge of herself and can control when she eats and when she doses her insulin and so on. But when she gets home, everything changes. It's very challenging to get her, family time in and exercise and kind of the things that she needs to take care of to prepare for the next day. And as a result of that, she tends to run high overnight to avoid overnight lows, just because she isn't watching things as closely or checking her glucose as often. And so here's her AGP report. And if we look at her time in ranges, she's got 50% time in target range with no time in the low or very low range. The AGP shows a pretty distinct spike here at dinner, followed by another spike in the sort of midnight-ish range, so kind of an evening pre-bed snack. And she reports looking at this, when I ask her, what do you see here? Immediately she says, yep, there's dinner here, this spike. And then this spike is when I have a snack before bed because I want to keep my glucose up so it doesn't go low overnight. And you'll notice no time in hypo range and pretty low variability kind of during the daytime, but much more variability going into the evening and overnight hours. And with the dailies, we can kind of walk through, what kind of patterns does she see? And again, here you can see that, dinner, there's a clear spike, and then many nights, not always, but many nights, there's another separate spike from that evening snack. And that evening snack, I should say, she does not cover with insulin. That's purely just to kind of keep the glucose higher overnight. And with dinner's a little bit of a moving target. Sometimes she gets busy and takes her dinner bolus right when she's eating, or takes her dinner dose, 5 or 10 minutes after she's started to eat. And so the recommendation that we came up with from that visit, so we looked at her profile and said, what are a couple things that we could change moving forward? And so one was to really work on not having that pre-bed snack, that snack to keep the glucose high, because it's actually causing her to spend more time in the hyperglycemia range. And if she did feel that she needed to eat before bed or have a snack, that she cover that with some insulin, just to manage that hyperglycemia. And then for dinner, we talked about getting that dinner bolus of insulin in always or as consistently as possible before she eats. So 5, 10, maybe even 15 minutes before she eats on a consistent basis, so that when the insulin is having its peak action, that is when the glucose is also at its peak. And so there's a little bit more of a match between the insulin and the glucose. And so she comes back after making those changes. And again, I want to see her back, soon. I don't want to wait 3 months or 6 months to the next visit. I want to see my patients in 2 weeks, 3 weeks to see how our changes played out, and for better or for worse. And so she comes back with a time in range of 79%, and with that, no increase in hypoglycemia. So really, really significant improvement for her. We were both really excited to see this. And you can see here that that overnight kind of dinner peak it's still there. She's still doing it a little bit, but it's quite a bit more flat. And she's certainly more flat, narrowing in range throughout the day and even in the overnight here. But there still is this fairly substantial spike at dinner time. And so, and she has, she really says, I've made lots of efforts to take that insulin up front before I eat. I'm doing that consistently. So that's not the issue anymore. And so that really helps us to say, okay, well, if that's the case, then what we should act on here is to tighten the carb ratio. And that's what we did from this visit moving forward. And in the dailies, you can see that as well, that there's still just this dinner spike, but by and large, a big reduction in that overnight spike. And so what we can take away from Donna's case is that, when your evenings are hard for everybody, especially if you're living with diabetes and have a lot of responsibilities at home. And so this has just been a challenge for her, but CGM really gave her a new tool to get insights into her patterns during that time, because remember, it was just chaotic to her, and she was sort of eating to run things high because she didn't really have the data to prove that she needed to or didn't need to. So we got to really give her insights into that. And so the CGM helped her see the impact of that late night snacking, find that hyperglycemia around dinner, and work to change when she took her dose at dinner. And then also through all of this, we had a lot of talk about the alerts and alarms on her CGM and how she could set those to alert her if she was going low overnight, and sort of trusted a little bit that those will help rather than trying to run things high just to avoid that. And I encourage you to talk to your care team about those alerts and alarms. You know, they should be individualized. Not everyone is going to want to have the low set at 80 or 70. Those need to be individualized so that you don't get, you know, alarm fatigue from too many alarms going off. But they're a great tool that come along with many of the CGMs out there. And so takeaways from this case, you know, really rely on that CGM to give you insights about missed or delayed doses, particularly around meals and you know, snacks later into the evening. And then also, again, really rely on those alerts and alarms to help build confidence, not only overnight, but you know, with exercise and with other changing time periods in the day. And so with that, I'll end and just highlight that, you know, it's important that you keep in touch with your care team. You know, again, we've stressed this in the sessions that hypoglycemia is what I worry about the most for my patients. And so as a general rule of thumb, if you're, you know, seeing 4% of time spent less than 70 or more than 4%, or 1% or more or less than 54, by all means, those would be reasons to contact your team. Or really, if you're having any other concerns about when or how much hypoglycemia you're having. And then if the AGP profile is not FNIR, so, you know, again, that's flat, narrow, and in range. If you're taking a look at your AGP every week, every 2 weeks, and notice that there's certain periods where it's not necessarily flat, it's pretty wide, or you're just, you know, completely out of range, or all of the above, those would be good reasons to contact us and come up with a plan together so we can try to optimize that. So with that, I'll thank you, and I hope you'll stay around and look for more case study videos coming from the IDC team. Myself and Dr. Krigo, Dr. Martins, and Dana Gershnoff are also going to have some upcoming videos. So more to come. And if you have any questions, any cases, or any of those little hacks or tricks that you've learned, please share them with us using the Contact Us feature on the Diatribe website. Thank you.